Every empire rests on soldiers. That is not a secret. What the British Raj managed to do was stranger and far more clever than mere force. It made the occupied pay for the occupation. The army that held India down, that garrisoned its cities, guarded its frontiers, and made rebellion unthinkable, was not, in the end, paid for by Britain. It was paid for by India. Every rifle, every horse, every officer's pension, every barrack and boot charged to the revenues of the country the army was sitting on. It is one thing to be conquered. It is another to be sent the invoice for your own garrison. Tonight, we read that payroll. To understand the army of the Raj, you have to understand its fear. In 1857, the Great Rebellion had begun in the ranks of the company's own army, Indian soldiers, sepoys, turning on the masters who had trained and armed them. It very nearly ended British rule. And when it was over and the Crown took direct control, the people now running India drew one overriding conclusion: never again. The army must be rebuilt so that it could never again become the instrument of its own undoing. So the British Indian Army was reorganized from the ground up, around a single principle. The Indian soldier must remain essential. There were far too few Britons to garrison a subcontinent without him, but he must never again be able to seize the machine. The army would be Indian in its body and British in its grip. The first decision was arithmetic, a ratio. Before 1857, Indian soldiers had outnumbered British ones in the company's army by an enormous margin. After the rebellion, that margin was deliberately narrowed. The proportion of British troops was raised and then held there, region by region, as a matter of policy. Enough white soldiers stationed across India that no Indian uprising within the ranks could ever again hope to overwhelm them. And there was a second, quieter decision about who held the heavy weapons. The artillery, the cannon, the firepower that decides a battle, was kept very largely in British hands. The Indian soldier could carry a rifle. He would not control the guns. It was a structure designed less to defeat a foreign enemy than to make an internal one impossible. The third decision was about whom to recruit, and here the empire told itself a story. British officers developed a doctrine they called the martial races. The idea was that certain peoples of India, drawn heavily from the north and northwest, the Punjab and the hills and frontier districts, were by their very nature born fighters, hardy, loyal, brave, and that other peoples, often from the regions that had been most educated, most politically active, most troublesome in 1857, were simply not soldier material. Now, let's be clear about what this really was. It was not science. It was not even consistent. It was a recruitment policy dressed up as a law of nature. By drawing the army from particular communities and regions, often those seen as more loyal and further from the centers of nationalist politics, the British built a force tied to them, set apart from the wider population, and unlikely to make common cause with the next rebellion. And notice the elegance of it from London's point of view. A man recruited as a member of a chosen, martial race was being offered something: pride, status, a steady wage, a place in a respected regiment. His loyalty was bought not only with money, but with flattery, with the idea that he was special, set above his neighbors. An army assembled that way is far harder to turn. The soldier has been given a reason to identify with the uniform rather than the country it occupies. The doctrine was, in the end, a tool of division as much as recruitment, and its mark on which regions filled the ranks would outlast the empire by generations. The martial races theory was, underneath the flattery, a way of choosing soldiers who would point their rifles outward and never back at the men who paid them. Now we reach the heart of the matter, the bill. This army was large, and it was expensive, by some distance the single biggest item in the budget of British India, swallowing a huge share of the country's revenue every year. And almost all of that cost, the pay of the soldiers, the salaries and pensions of British officers, the equipment, the forts, the upkeep, was charged not to the British taxpayer, but to the Indian one. Think about the loop that creates. India's farmers and townspeople were taxed. That tax revenue paid for an army, and that army's central purpose was to keep those same farmers and townspeople under control. The people funded the force that held them. The force that held them justified the funding, a self-financing occupation. Britain held India. India paid Britain for the privilege of being held. But here's the part that turns a heavy burden into something close to absurd. This army, paid for entirely by India to keep India quiet, did not stay in India. The British discovered they had, in the Indian army, a ready-made imperial spear, a large, disciplined, mobile force already bought and paid for, and they used it. Indian soldiers were sent far beyond India's borders, again and again, to fight Britain's wars across Asia and Africa, in campaigns that had nothing to do with the defense of India itself, and everything to do with the ambitions of the empire. The reach was extraordinary. Indian troops were marched into the mountains of Afghanistan, shipped to fight in China, deployed across the Middle East, and sent to hold and expand British interests in Africa. Wherever the empire needed bodies in uniform, India could supply them, trained, equipped, and conveniently financed by someone other than the British taxpayer. A frontier war hundreds of miles from any Indian village could be fought largely with Indian soldiers, and a good portion of the cost still landed, by one accounting device or another, on India's books. And when the Indian army was sent abroad to fight Britain's wars, a large share of the cost was still charged, wherever the rules could be stretched to allow it, back to Indian revenues. India did not merely garrison itself at its own expense, it helped garrison the empire, with its own men, on its own account. The subcontinent had become the empire's barracks, its recruiting ground, and its paymaster all at once. So when you picture the might of the British Raj, the disciplined regiments, the global reach, remember whose money built it. The army that made India ungovernable from within and that carried British power outward across the world ran on Indian revenue, from the first rupee to the last. That is the deepest line in this whole series. The empire's strength in India was not something Britain spent its own treasure to maintain. It was something India was made to buy, year after year, and then made to lend out. But a country can only be billed for so long before it learns to read the bill. And in our next episode, for the first time, Indians turn the ledger all the way around. They begin to boycott, to build, to audit back. Next time, Swadeshi, Tareekh ka Hisaab, history audited. Hisaab abhi baki hai. The account isn't settled yet.